Welcome to Tagged Beyond the Award, the podcast that celebrates innovation, excellence, and leadership. Each episode dives into inspiring stories behind the nominees and winners of the TAG Awards, uncovering the breakthroughs, challenges, and triumphs that define their journey. Whether it's cutting-edge technology, transformative products, or visionary leadership, we're here to explore what it means to stand out and shape the future of your industry. Let's go beyond the award and into the heart of innovation. Here's your host, Justin Starbird.
Welcome back to Tagged Beyond the Award. My name is Justin Starbird, and today I am excited to introduce Dr. Helen Reeve Stoffer, the Chief Operating Officer for Recor Medical, who is joining me today from Palo Alto. Good morning, Helen. How are you today?
Morning, Justin. I am good, thank you. It's a privilege to talk to you.
I think the privilege is all mine to hear about your incredible journey and the story, behind Recor Medical and all that you're doing. So I'm really looking forward to this. I think I mentioned offline, this has been sort of circled on my list of companies I couldn't wait to speak to. So thank you so much for being here.
That's great. I appreciate it very much.
So let's just, jump in for those that are unfamiliar, although at this point I'm not sure who would be. Talk a little bit about Recor Medical and, what it is that you guys are solving.
Sure. So I don't know if everybody knows that Recor has actually been around since 2009. We were founded back in 2009 on the basis that our belief that ultrasound energy could be the perfect modality for renal denervation. We're in 2026, so you can see it's been a pretty long and convoluted journey. I think we talked a little bit about that offline as well, and I'm happy to talk a bit about kind of where we've come from. But ultimately, the idea was that we could use a catheter-based technology to try and reduce blood pressure. So very simply, you have a balloon catheter, you place it in the renal artery, you use ultrasound energy to impact the tissue that's surrounding the renal artery, and that impacts the nervous activity that's then going to the kidney. And the idea is that the high blood pressure is caused by overactivity to the kidneys. If you can reduce that activity with the ultrasound energy, then you can bring down blood pressure. Catheters removed, so nothing remains in the body. It's pretty straightforward. Intuitive from the physiology, certainly. But I think the challenge has been that blood pressure control has been firmly in the arms of the pharma company prior to this. And so being able to convince both the agencies but also physicians that there's a need for a device-based option for high blood pressure has been, a challenge, especially considering some of the early data that we dealt with.
Actually, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that because it seems, as you mentioned, so intuitive today, and something that should have been done a long time ago. But you've also been at this for 16 years or so, in one way or another. Of course, that also says no overnight success happens overnight, and the journey of a med tech startup is often long and arduous anyway. But take me back to the beginning when you were faced with those challenges in the OR and other places that said there's no way that this can help.
I think there's a couple of things. So firstly, we were up against the challenge that blood pressure has always been treated by medicines. And the people that were prescribing the medicines, the people that were kind of deep into the medical practice from that side, really believe that you can control blood pressure with medication, and you absolutely can. I mean, that's clear. The problem is there's this issue of the patients, and the patients being non-compliant, and the patients not wanting to take medicines. And I don't think it was until we started to bring some of the medical technologies to the forefront that people were willing to admit that was actually a challenge. And so we had a lot of pushback in the early days. And I think some of the earlier data, even before the Simplicity HTN-3 trial failed, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's sort of a pivotal moment in the history of renal denervation. The hypertension specialists were looking at the data that came from the devices and saying that it could be too good to be true. I think that's the way that it was looked at. And when I joined Recor, which was in 2013, and now you've mentioned 16 years, it makes me feel really old, Justin, so thank you. It was literally 9 months before Medtronic made the announcement that Simplicity HTN-3 had failed its primary endpoint. And I thought to myself at that point, was this the worst career decision I've ever made? Actually, it was the best career decision I've ever made, I'm thankful to say, but at that time I wasn't sure. And I think the Simplicity HTN-3, the Simplicity HTN-3 trial failing was the point at which we realized we had to do something different in terms of developing the clinical evidence to support renal denervation. And that was the point at which we all went back to the drawing board with the support actually of FDA, and also with the support of some of the societies like ACC and the American Society of Hypertension at that time, and redesigned how we should look at determining whether renal denervation worked or not. And so to me, that point was pivotal in kind of the journey of renal denervation. But you can also imagine that when you have such a massive failure in an industry like that, the negative impact that it can have is huge. And so I think the bar that we were given to prove was probably much higher, certainly than for medications. But in the face of having failed data, I think we all as an industry had to kind of pull ourselves up and look at it a bit differently.
You mentioned failure, and while no one is discounting that it didn't work that initial time when Medtronic came out, Omar Ford, one of our esteemed judges and editor-in-chief of MDDI for Informa, actually talked and spoke glowingly about the journey that you've been on, and how initially that data set was flawed, and how it was determined that it failed. Like, talk a little bit about that and how that was recognized by Recor, and what you did to make those changes to fundamentally alter how how success is measured. Because I think that's really the element of the journey that was so unique, and not just that you didn't give up, but that you recognize that even though this giant medtech device company who's been around for a long time, because they couldn't do it, didn't necessarily deter you or the team from charging forward.
No, I mean, not at all. I think, the tenacity within the Recor team was obvious, but we were firstly working on the basis that we had incredible and many years of very strong R&D data supporting that the technology worked. So we knew that what it was supposed to do, it does, from the basis of R&D. And then what we did, and maybe slightly differently, probably because we were a startup and for us this was all that we were focused on, we actually went, and I say we, at that point it was me as vice president of clinical, went to some of the people that actually know how to run blood pressure trials, not necessarily medical device trials. So we worked with Professor Michel Azizi out of Paris, who originally had not been a strong proponent of renal denervation. He had actually designed his own trial back in the earlier days, and he'd actually designed that trial to look at medications versus renal denervation. And I think he would admit was surprised to find that renal denervation had a benefit in the patient population over drugs. And so when I was designing the trials, I went to him to work out how you design a trial properly for blood pressure. And he taught us everything about how to make sure that you look at these trials very specifically, taking into consideration that high blood pressure is a pharma-based level of evidence, and you design those trials very differently from medical device trials.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably the key. We didn't have the option of other things to do, and so we really had to make sure that as we went down this journey, we were doing the best we could to design the trials to demonstrate whether the Paradise system worked or not.
So tell me why you continued to keep going though, because the easy button has been pharma, and people by and large have seemed okay enough. And there wasn't a clamoring for, this sort of answer to it. I mean, it feels obvious today. Here we are in 2026 and beginning of May, and yes, you've started to have a lot, success with this, and now you're winning awards, which we're so excited. But
Which we appreciate very much. So thank you.
So all these things are, it seems so obvious now, but I mean, you mentioned the tenacity of the team, but what gave you the wherewithal to look at it from a different perspective, to go to such esteemed colleagues and ask how they did things so that you could continue to see this through?
I think it ultimately comes down to the size of the problem. Because if you think about the population of hypertensive patients globally, it's enormous. I mean, just a massive, massive pandemic. I mean, if you just look at the US, I think there's well over 100 million patients who have high blood pressure. And unfortunately, as we age, the prevalence gets worse. And so just having other options for patients is an absolute necessity, because when I started to look at the data, and also, Michel Azizi was a very strong advocate on this side, it was clear that we're not doing a very good job of controlling blood pressure. If you look at the numbers, 50% of patients not controlled, at least. And so there has to be other options. And having device-based therapies, which are, designed based on very strong physiology, I mean, it's automatically has to be a possibility, because the drug side is just not working.
Yeah.
And some of the interesting data that came out of our clinical studies, not necessarily around the blood pressure lowering effect, was really supporting that concept that patients are not compliant with their medications. One of our trials that we ran, the TRIO trial, we took patients who were on multiple medications and we put them on a single pill. So that single pill had 3 antihypertensive medications in it. And theoretically, all these patients that entered the trial were resistant hypertension, meaning they were taking a lot of drugs, but their blood pressure was still high. And 80% of the patients that we put on this single pill, their blood pressure came down. So it just shows you, firstly, that patients are not compliant with medication. They have to have other options.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably really the driver.
So you mentioned 100 million patients just in the United States that are at risk or have hypertension. And, anything that you talk about diet, you talk about aging, you talk about the environment around us, and social, political climate, there are all sorts of elements that contribute to that. And, as a result, there's now the World Hypertension Day. It's
Yes.
May 16th. So hopefully we get this out here before that day, to continue to raise awareness. And it just seems as though that is a huge opportunity for the company to, not just showcase what you're able to do, but, enlighten people to share that there is alternative to what pharma puts out.
I think that's right. World Hypertension Day is obviously a very important day for us. And we celebrate it across the company with social media, but also we try to encourage healthy habits across the company as well. We do team walks, etc. I'm a huge advocate of exercise as a way of reducing stress, and ultimately that can help blood pressure too. I think the thing we have to remember also with high blood pressure is that it's kind of a silent killer. The impact of having prolonged high blood pressure is very important to understand that, patients with prolonged uncontrolled hypertension can be at risk of stroke or of cardiac events. And then ultimately also it impacts the body in that it can precipitate other comorbidities such as atrial fibrillation or chronic kidney disease or heart failure. So while the majority of patients probably don't feel anything, the impact on their bodies and the impact on their cardiovascular morbidity is huge. And so again, just the recognition of World Hypertension Day, and then again bringing to the forefront that the industries across the board, whether it's pharma or medical devices, have to work harder at finding options for patients to lower blood pressure is really important. Unfortunately, unless everybody lives on a beach and has a stress-free life, this is going to be something that we have to tackle ongoing. So, as you said, there's a lot of things in the world that are going to precipitate the continuation of needs to tackle high blood pressure.
Yeah, I mean, and that is unfortunately the reality that we live in.
Yeah.
And it's you know, those sorts of things are not fun to talk about. But one thing that does come out of this are more healthy patients. So talk about or share what the data is saying and the relief that folks are feeling when they go through and use this, essentially procedure to uh, have hypertension alleviated versus the ongoing potential side effects of taking large pills for years on end.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the therapy that we bring, so that the renal denervation therapy with the Paradise system, hasn't been designed with the idea that it's going to bring patients off their medications. Although anecdotally we have seen that happen. But what we are seeing is that patients in the real world, and we just presented this data last year at TCT, are seeing a 20 plus millimeter drop in blood pressure, which is incredibly impactful. The impact on cardiovascular risk when you see those type of drops in blood pressure is huge. And I think the other thing that we learn, and we actually have a patient day here at Recor, and we bring patients in because not to sidetrack from your question, but I think when you're a company where you've got everybody working on one thing, bringing the patients in and seeing the impact of what they're doing every day is huge. And I mean, we've had patients that have come to our patient days talking about things like their blood pressure was so high that they, were bleeding from their ears. That patients whose other comorbidities have put them, literally at risk of losing their life. And then they have the therapy and the blood pressure comes down and they feel better. And, you know, anecdotally, as you feel better and as maybe you're able to come off a couple of meds, and then you can exercise and then you can play with your kids, these are things that are hugely impactful. And we're hearing this from our patients. And it's important for me that everybody in my company hears that, because, when you come into work day to day, it's very important that you understand the impact you're having on patients.
It's incredible to recognize that potential impact on 100 million folks that are just in the United States that are dealing with that in some capacity. So to put this out there as a total addressable market that's even beyond that is enormous. And just like you're here with me today talking about what you're doing, I've got to imagine that has gives the team the fortitude to keep going and see that, hey, we can't give up now. We're so close to the next iteration.
Yeah, I think innovation is key. I mean, our technology has been on a very long journey, as we've discussed. I mean, we've only been commercial for 3 years. So if you think about the rest of the story, that's been the R&D development. So it's a very complicated technology that I think we may look simple. But innovation is key, and getting to the next stage of development of the therapy is going to be also impactful for patients. But I think I just wanted to kind of mention, the appreciation for the TAG Award. We have in the company, we have it up on all the screens that we won the TAG Award, and we did a big social media campaign, and I talked to all the employees about it. And I do think these kind of things are really important for team members to recognize that they are being externally validated. I have people in my team, actually. I've been with the company for 14 years. There's one other person in the company that's been here 3 months longer than me, and she's in the manufacturing group. So she's actually one of the people that puts the catheters together. And so for people like her, and for people like the engineers that have worked so hard on kind of developing the ultrasound technology, things like the TAG Award are huge. They really are. So we just wanted to, just to iterate that and say thank you.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. So TAG, of course, stands for the Technology Achievement and Growth of a Business, Product, or Service that has, become commercial, and you guys embody all three of those things. I'd add, persistence and overcoming challenges. Like there are so many other things that we could share that you have done. So, you mentioned the ability to, stay dialed in on solving this for so long. That said, you're recently promoted to the chief operating officer of the company. Now you're tasked with running day-to-day operations and also maintaining a level of innovation so that you continue to iterate. Talk a little bit about both your leadership style as well as the approach to innovation and what you're looking for next.
So leadership wise, I think probably because I've been with the company for such a long time, and this is literally embedded in my DNA. I think everybody would say that I'm a pretty transparent leader. I believe in leveraging and leveling up the people under me so that they can be autonomous, so that they get basically the go ahead to do what's necessary with the responsibility that they deliver. I absolutely love my job. I walk around here and know pretty much everybody in the entire company. So a very open leadership style, but of the belief that we need to deliver. I think that's clear. And I hope that the team believe that because of the history of the company and where I've been in that history, that they have, the feeling that we will continue to innovate and deliver. And ultimately, the way that we look about innovation is taking into consideration what the patient needs. And that's definitely the way that we're looking for the future. So how do we get this to be a procedure which is, let's just take a number out of the air, a 15-minute procedure? What is necessary to make it so that it's the simplest procedure, the most patient-friendly procedure that it can possibly be? What do we need to change in the future to make that happen? And ultimately, if you take that approach, innovation will continue. And that's definitely the way that we're looking at in Recor.
Yeah, that's exciting and so true, because often listening to the patient, listening to the surgeons and the folks that are actually doing the work, that is your best test case always, right? Is how quickly does the patient recover? How easy is it for it to, the procedure to be implemented and complete? Yeah, I feel like those are definitely ways to continue to iterate and so important to have that feedback.
It has to be basically that we get to the point where the fact that it's a device-based technology is not a barrier, because still, there is some feeling that if you're looking at a device, then it's potentially a higher risk procedure than taking medication. None of the data would suggest that. The data suggests that it's very, very safe. But if you can get to a point where it is, almost a really boring procedure, then I think you're doing the best that you can for the patients.
So let me ask you this, Helen, what's on the horizon for Recor Medical? What's next?
So I think what next is really continuing our commercial growth. As I said, we've only been doing this for 3 years, along with the history of the complexity of kind of the development, but also the clinical evidence. Going to the commercial world has not been straightforward because we're developing an entire new therapy. So this is not just bringing a new device into something that's already established. We stepped into a world where there was no reimbursement, and so we've had to drive the reimbursement pathway. We stepped into a world still where there's a lot of resistance about the therapy, unfortunately, because of trials like Simplicity HTN-3, which seems crazy at this point, but you still get pushback of that. So, focusing on developing the market and the programs is absolutely key for us from the commercial side. I mean, thankfully, we've got a very stable partner. Our parent company, Otsuka Medical, is hugely supportive of us and is watching us through this journey and making sure that, you know, we're stable and we're funded and that we have everything we need to be successful. And then ultimately collecting more clinical evidence in the real world to show that what this does in the more extreme patients that we're treating now versus the clinical patients that we treated in the studies that we use for FDA. And then just iterations of the technology. So I think those three big buckets are basically what I'm doing every single day to try and drive this the success of the company.
Yeah, no big deal. Every
No,
day.
nothing,
Yeah.
you know. But no, honestly, Justin, as I said, you know, this is embedded in my DNA. So I get up every day. I'm excited to be able to run this and to see what we're doing for patients. So ultimately, that's the reward.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love you know, it isn't often, and because on the medical device side, especially where you have to push the market and pull it through, right? Like most of the time, there's one or the other. There's already a reimbursement code, or there's you know, there's a pathway
Yeah.
ahead or before you. This you truly beat down the path to make it, and are now, you know, going back, putting up the signs in the road map to say, hey, come along, follow me.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think maybe that's where we have the advantage of this is all we do. You know, so we develop programs. We look at our accounts as being part of a team approach. We have very strong people in the group that look at everything from the market access, so reimbursement, coding, pre-authorization of patients, etc. We create a team around our accounts because this is our focus. This is all we do. And so not dissimilar to the way that we had to pivot when we were doing the clinical trials. Again, you know, I'm sitting here being able to tell you about the success that, you know, we've developed over the last years, but it was not an easy pathway. And there were several points at which we really had to pivot to be able to be successful. And I think the same thing now, as we're learning from our customers what their needs are, then we pivot and we create programs to support them. And you know, you had mentioned about being in the hospitals and seeing kind of what the physicians are doing. I encourage all of my leaders to be close with our customers so that they can see firsthand exactly how they can do things better, because that's the only way that you learn. Sitting in an office, you can make a decision, but actually being with a physician and talking to them and seeing what they're doing, that's when you realize how impactful that decision is.
Yeah, then that decision becomes, it impacts change. It
That's
impacts
right. Exactly. That's
improvement,
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I get it. That's awesome. Well, Helen, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy day to share some context, some history, and you know what it means to win the TAG Award this year. We're so happy to have you as part of our class of 2026.
Thank you. We appreciate being tagged.
Yes, indeed. And you know, to be clear, it was the medical device category for cardiovascular therapeutic innovation that you won in. So, you know, we were loved the feedback from the judges. The nomination was great. So, you know, so happy to be able to share your story. So, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Justin.
On behalf of my guest today, Dr. Helen Reeve Stoffer, Chief Operating Officer of Recor Medical. You've been listening and hopefully watching Tagged Beyond the Award. Until next time.
On behalf of our guest today and host Justin Starbird, thank you for listening to Tagged Beyond the Award. We hope you've been inspired by the stories of innovation and leadership shared today. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for more incredible journeys behind the breakthroughs. If you or someone you know is leading the way in innovation, visit tagawards.co to learn more about how to get involved. Until next time, stay driven, keep innovating, and keep reaching for excellence.